welcome back to Think Outside the Board. I'm your host, Brian Toohey, and today I'm actually going to be doing a full teach and review for Cantaloop Book 1, Breaking into Prison. Now, I had originally thought I was going to do a first impressions video. That's what I've been doing lately with all the kind of new games that are coming in, and the idea is to get a first impressions video out first, kind of describing some of the aspects of gameplay and my initial feelings on it, just so that people have something, right when a Kickstarter delivers or a retail game has just been released. And then I can follow up that later once I've had some more time with it and I can give a full review. Well, in this case, the gameplay in Cantaloop is only about 5 to 8 hours long. So I have already completed and solved the game, and I figured why even bother with the first impressions? We can go right into the full teach and review. And there's really not that much to teach either. It's very simple. It's very intuitive. Cantaloop is basically a board game version of a point-and-click adventure. Now, these go back to Infocom's games in the early 80s. These are games that I grew up with, and they were pre-point-and-click adventure because there were no graphics, because it was too complicated to have graphics in a game at that time. So those games were called text adventures, and you would travel around and pick up items and try to solve puzzles. These games, if you're a little younger and you weren't alive at that time, you may have heard of some of the more famous ones like Zork. There was a whole Zork series. I think it ended with Beyond Zork. There were like 4 or 5 games when all was said and done. But the original Zork game is the game that kind of started it all for Infocom. Although actually, if you go back even further, it's Adventure, which I think became Zork or inspired Zork. And Adventure was even mentioned and talked about in *Halt and Catch Fire*, which was a pretty good TV show from a few years ago that talked about some software designers in Silicon Valley, I believe, in the 80s. The personal computing wars of the 80s. Anyway, so Infocom kind of started the whole thing. Then you had Sierra Online, which did King's Quest and Space Quest and Police Quest, a lot of games with Quest in the titles, and they actually did do point-and-click adventures. They were kind of the first ones that I'm aware of that did that. Also around that time, you had Leisure Suit Larry and a whole series of those games. And then things kind of spawned into the Lucasfilm games and Maniac Mansion, Day of the Tentacle. And then that kind of gave way to Tales of Monkey Island might have been Lucas. I think, yeah, Tales of Monkey Island was LucasArts as well. And then as time went on, you had Double Fine got into the act, and then Telltale. But then Telltale eventually kind of expanded away from the point-and-click games. That they did those with Sam & Max, and they had some really funny, really clever games. And then as time went on, they kind of embraced more of a storytelling narrative game, which was less concerned with puzzles and combining of items, but more concerned with picking a branching dialogue. And that was games like The Walking Dead and The Wolf Among Us and kind of all those games they did in that series. But, while they've been doing that, other designers have been picking up the slack, and there are games like the Deponia games. There's a ton of point-and-click adventures out there. Some of them are good, some of them are great, some of them are terrible, some of them are really obtuse, some of them are funny, some of them are not as funny as they think they are. How's this one? Well, let me take you over to the table, show you how it's played, which I can do very quickly, and then we'll come back to this camera setup and I'll tell you what I thought about this one in the overall scope of point-and-click adventure games and the point-and-click adventure history. So this is the game Cantaloop right here. It comes in this binder, which you can see. It's not a box, it's an actual binder. And you're going to open this up like this, and then you'll have 3 sets of cards. And as you can see, I've already pulled them out, but they'll be divided into groups of 20 cards just so that they fit. So you'll get 20 cards in this kind of cardboard construction packet, 20 in this and 20 in this. And then down in here, you're going to have a few extra items, and those are these items. So you're going to have this little card, which when we played, we just made a copy of this, like a Xerox of this. But whenever you do certain things in the game, certain events, you will cross off one of these things. And this is the way, since you're essentially playing a point and click adventure in an analog form, this will replace, certain kind of behind the scenes things that would happen in a video game that would let the computer know, oh, okay, he's already done this. Like he's already completed this story point. He's already completed the story element, or he's already combined these elements. But this will essentially be programming for the game so that it knows that you've done certain things. And then when you go to certain dialogues or try to do certain things later in the game, a lot of times it'll say, if D1, then blah, 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 and it'll tell you to read a certain passage. Or it might say, if, D1 and G1, then blah, blah, blah. And it might say, if none of those things, then blah, blah, blah. So the information that you're receiving, both in conversations and in your exploring, will sometimes depend on what you have previously done. And this is the way for the game to sort of keep track of that. Now, you've also got this Cantaloop postcard, which has certain locations on it, and there'll be numbers that you can go to in the game locations. And all of these reminds me of, if you've ever played those before point and click adventures back in the 80s, back in the mid 80s, go back even to the early 80s, there was a company called Infocom, and they did what were called text adventures. And this was before graphics. So this was when it was too expensive to make games with graphics. And you would walk around and you would do things. You would explore things, you would find things. Some games you might have heard of in this series are things like Zork, the Zork games, Beyond Zork, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I mean, they had probably over 50 titles. Leather Goddesses of Phobos, that was another one. A Mind Forever Voyaging. There were a ton of these games. And they were all pretty cool. But this was at a time when there wasn't a high level of security in games, or you couldn't really stop pirating. It was very easy to make a copy of a disc. So what they did is they had some of these kind of physical components, physical elements, and there would be certain things that would happen in the game that would have you refer to the physical components, and you might have to answer a question, or you'd have a code or something like that. And that was their way of sort of preventing against pirating. It meant that if you got a copy of the disc for the game, but you didn't have the physical components, you wouldn't be able to play the game, or you wouldn't be able to proceed very far in the game before you got hit with something that would, you'd need a physical component to be able to continue. So this reminds me of that, or pays homage to those Infocom games. So you've got a map here, you've got a sheet here, which is a list of codes and things. Now you're going to have something similar to this on the individual pages of the game. When you are in a certain location, and this is the starting location, so I feel like it's okay to show this, this will have certain codes in red that are specific to things here. And you'll use this little red card and you'll put it down. I don't want to reveal anything, but you'll put it down over this, this language. And when you put it over something that's, got the red and black text, it'll negate the red and you'll be able to read the black text very clearly. So this is a way of just having all this kind of information here, but you can't read it. So you're only getting to read specifically what you're trying to read. Now, everything in a page here will refer to the scene that you're at. So what is this for, you ask? Well, you're going to have these cards. Now, some of these cards, most of these cards, are going to be items like the two items that you start with. And you'll start with a magnifying glass and a cell phone. Now, you can use certain items together. You can combine items. So the cards each have a number on them. And if I hold them close enough, you can see that this card has a 12 and this card has a 38. So whenever you're trying to combine items, you're going to take the larger number and put it next to the smaller number like that. And it will give you a code. So in this case, it's H7P5. So if you're doing something where you're combining items from cards, you will then go to this page. You'll take your handy dandy little red decoder sheet and you'll look up, what was it, H7P5. You'll look this up on the sheet and you will right here. You'll just cover that, and it says, use cell phone, who you gonna call? So, Ghostbusters reference. But the magnifying glass is basically something that you're using to examine things. And if you've played these kinds of games before, there's always some kind of code to examine items. So in this game, that essentially becomes the magnifying glass. And there are certain places that you're going to be able to go throughout this game that you can't take some of your items, you can't take all of your items, but you can always take the magnifying glass, so that always gives you the ability to examine things. Now, if I was doing something on the board here, like this series of codes refers to this island, and you can see there's kind of like an arrow that's extending off of these codes. So that's what the codes are referring to. So over here, this group of codes refers to this, the lighthouse lamp. So if I wanted to look at that, I would take my magnifying glass, I'd put it here, and I'd get I3P5. And because that code is right here on this page, that's going to be over here. So I would look at I3P5, and I use the decoder ring, and it's going to give me some text about this light. Now, occasionally there will be just things here, just a code. So in this case, that's just something that you can observe, an item you can look at, and the code will be over here, and you can just go and look at that. Usually when I'm playing these games, I just do that first. I look at anything that's just a code that's here, and I look that up, kind of get my bearings. Then I usually use the magnifying glass to look at all the different items, and I look up those codes. And then from there, I start to fiddle around with the things in the area, maybe combining items that I have or using items with it. You'll also have these arrows here, which will allow you to travel to another location. So when you're here at the top of the lighthouse, you can go to this second location, O2, which will take you down to the bottom of the lighthouse. And then again, the arrow goes back to O1. So that's kind of your starting location, are these two, well, in a point-and-click adventure, it would be screens. In this case, they are pages. You can't go anywhere other than this until you do some exploring and things like that, and find some more locations and some places to go. But that is essentially your gameplay here. You are going to be combining items. You're going to be using those items to look at things on the pages. You're going to be exploring different locations. You'll be acquiring items in the way of cards over here. And sometimes there's other cards. There can be cards in the game that will allow you to overlay it on a page if you sort of change something in a setting from your actions. And sometimes there are these interesting achievement cards where if you do something that's either incredibly stupid or incredibly smart, you might get a little achievement card. Now, that doesn't really do anything. It's just fun for you. It's part of the humor of the game. So it feels very much like the Deponia games or the Monkey Island games or like, Maniac Mansion and Day of the Tentacle. It has similar art, this kind of bright, colorful art. There's humor in it. I mean, like there's a Band-Aid here on the light for the lighthouse, and obviously the whole thing looks very ramshackle. So you're going to be going around, you're going to be, using your little decoder sheet to explore your surroundings, combine items, see what happens when you use certain items with the things on the page. If you ever get really, really hung up, there is a hint section that you can go to in the back. And the hint section is fairly intelligent in the way it's created, which, if you remember, at the beginning of this, I showed you this little card that has these kind of checklist of events that you need to kind of proceed through. And if you ever get really stuck, you just go to one of the kind of main two puzzles that you're trying to solve, and you can kind of just scan down the checklist area and compare it with what you've finished. And when you first get to something that you haven't completed, it'll tell you like a clue number, and you'll go over there with your little decoder sheet. It'll kind of summarize the problem, and it'll give you two different tips and then the solution. Now, this is very well kind of designed and implemented, I think. The only problem with this is that, as some of these games often do, sometimes the tips are just kind of funny and they don't actually give you any help, and then the solution spells it all out to you. So you may go from really having no help at all to just having the answer given to you. But it does depend item per item. And some of them work well with the hints. The last thing that will happen is occasionally you will get into conversations with people. And the locations are all by number. There are conversations by letter. So you would flip to a conversation, you'll go over this, and sometimes there are aspects to the conversation that you cannot read until you've unlocked, one of these things. And sometimes there are multiple ones that you have to unlock to read all of the conversations. But that's essentially the gameplay. It's very simple. There is a little tutorial at the beginning that kind of spells it out to you over the first, few pages. And that is it. It's not so much a board game as it is a puzzle and kind of an experience, really. And gameplay-wise, it's very simple. The only thing, if you look at this is a little kind of clumsy and fiddly with these. You can see that they already, just immediately from when I bought it, these things had kind of stained the cover sheet, and the whole binder was a little bit warped. They needed to keep these cards in here somehow, so this is how they decided to do it. If you watch Tom Vasel's review, he says he thinks that he would have rather this come in a box rather than them try to do it in this binder. And I think I agree with Tom. I do understand that they wanted this to stand out a little bit. And I mean, it does stand out. You can put it somewhere in a game store, maybe by the register. And because it looks like a binder, maybe it can appeal a little bit more as sort of an impulse purchase. And it's smaller, so it's not as big as a game box. They could kind of stack these over by the checkout. But I think a better solution might have been a box, just because the binder warps. These things are kind of difficult to get open, and then when you put the cards back in, because I mean you're going to have to store it somehow, right? These are not going to have the longest life. On the other hand, there's only 5 to 8 hours of gameplay in this thing, so you don't really need it to last that long. But I suppose if you're getting rid of it, whether you're selling it or giving it to a friend or donating it or something, it would be nice to have the game still in decent condition. And that's one reason why you may want to make a copy of this and not actually mark up this checklist. Anyway, let's go back to the first setup, and I will tell you what I thought about Cantaloop Book 1, Breaking into Prison. And welcome back. So before I get to my feelings about the game, let's talk about it. If I'm going to do a full review, let's kind of talk about some of the features of this game. Now, first of all, it is published by Lookout Games, and Lookout Games does a ton of stuff, but mainly here in the United States, they publish all of the Uwe Rosenberg games. I'm not going to list all of those games because I'm going to talk about one of the artists in a minute, and I'm going to list a lot of his games, and they're most of the same games. It was designed by Friedman Findeisen and Gregor Kobiela, and this is basically their first game, their first published game. Now, the other thing to be aware of is that this is designed to be part 1 of 3. So if you have been playing some of these Telltale games in the last 5 or 10 years, you may know that often when they release those games, they release them in sections, often in about 5 pieces. So you might get one piece, it comes out, you'll pay $5 or $10. Then a few months later, the next piece comes out. At the end of the day, you'll be able to buy the whole game for maybe $25 or $30, but they also allow you to kind of buy a piecemeal. And similarly to that, Cantaloop is being released piecemeal in 3 parts. However, it's a little more expensive. Instead of paying $5 or $10 per part, or $25 to $30 total, the MSRP on this is, I think, $30. So if you get all 3 games, it's going to end up being $90, which is significantly more than a lot of those point-and-click adventure games. But we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Anyway, those are the designers. The artists are Kirsten Buzelan and Johan Lott, and this is pretty much their first work. But of everyone involved, also Clemens Franz is involved, and he's an artist, and he has so many games that he's worked on. I'm just going to quickly list off the games that Clemens Franz has done artwork for that are in the BGG Top 1000, just to give you an idea of how prolific he is, and you've probably seen his artwork around quite a bit. So those games in order of popularity are Orleans, Caverna, Agricola, Clans of Caledonia, Le Havre, Mombasa, Grand Austrian Hotel, Patchwork, Lorenzo il Magnifico, Ora et Labora, Suburbia, Watergate, Isle of Skye from Chieftain to King, Glory to Rome, Agricola, All Creatures Big and Small, Altiplano, Barren Park, Endeavor, At the Gates of Loyang, Newton, The Colonists, Bonanza, Port Royal, Automobile, Snowdonia, Luna, Mandala, Caverna, Cave versus Cave, Oh My Goods, Can't Stop, Riverboat, and Hallertau. So Clemens Franz has worked on a lot of great games, including most Uwe Rosenberg games. So that's who made this game. Time, complexity, and genre, well, it's not like a regular board game. It is a storytelling narrative game, and you are essentially going to play it once. You can break that up into multiple sessions if you want, but you're looking at probably about 5 to 8 hours for the whole experience. Now, if I had to put it in a class of game, again, we're saying that this is an analog version of a point-and-click adventure computer game. But if you want to sort of break it down into board game mechanics, it's essentially storytelling and deduction, really. And they say that you can play it with 1 to 4 players. There's no real system in the game to deal with multiple players. So I'm not sure if I tried to play it with 4 players. I think maybe you're going to be at your best with 2. You could do it solo and just have it be your own experience. But if you want to have someone else involved and it may be more fun that way, I think maybe it's best as a 2-player game. And that's how I played it. Going 3 to 4, it might just be problematic because if everyone wants to do something different, if one person wants to examine this, one person wants to combine these items, someone else wants to go to a different location. I mean, you can't do everything at once. And there is no mechanism in the game to kind of create a turn order. So it would just be up to the group of people to kind of say, okay, let's just kind of take turns doing things. And that's fine. You can do that if you're comfortable doing that. But depending on who you're playing with, if it's not kind of a group of friends and family, it could just get a little difficult to kind of corral everyone's choices and not have people feel left out. So for my money, I'd probably keep it at 1 to 2 players. Theme and production quality. Well, we've said that the theme here is essentially a board game analog adaptation or version of a point-and-click adventure game. And I think just from looking at it, from looking at the art and the way it compares to those other games and the way they've kind of implemented the mechanics from point-and-click adventure games, I think they've done a really stellar job, at least sort of superficially and cosmetically. I mean, it works well for what it is. I don't know if I love having the little red thing to kind of read everything, but I think it's ingenious and it works, and I can't think of a better way to do it. The only real problem is you are sort of in playing this game peeling back the, I guess, veil of the computer game. So you're going to see things like, all the responses, even if you're not reading them, they're going to be there. So you're going to be aware of them in a way you wouldn't when you're playing a computer game or a video game where you're just sitting there, with the controller and you're looking at the screen and you're very immersed in that world. The immersion here is not as deep. You kind of see the seams of the game kind of all around the packaging, and that can break the immersion to some degree. Also, the fact that you have that kind of checklist with the events on it, you are essentially kind of doing the work that the memory of a computer game or a video game would be doing behind the scenes. And that's okay. That's all right. It works. And like I said, it works fairly well when you think of how it could have worked poorly. But the seams do show, and it does affect the immersion somewhat. But at the same time, I think they're in keeping with the art style and the kind of humor and the puzzles and the snarkiness of a lot of those point-and-click adventure games. I would say that the game is a little bit fiddly, though, because of the way they've kind of had to do that analog packaging and the cards and things. The cards are probably the thing that I mind the least because they are fun and they're fun to combine them. So even though they're fiddly, I like that element a lot of the packaging system. I just think that, like Tom Vassell, I probably would have preferred it come in a box rather than try to be a little too clever in a binder that kind of warps and doesn't really hold the components that well. I mean, you saw that the cards have to go back in those pockets, which don't seem like they're going to last that well. But the other thing is below that was kind of a big sleeve where the map and the checklist and your little kind of red decoder sheet and then the whole big kind of code sheet for the items, they all slot into that folder. But if you're carrying that binder around and you turn it sideways or upside down, it's very easy for those things to just kind of fall out. And I mean, you could lose them if you're walking around or traveling with it. So that's maybe not the best packaging. And lastly, I think, is the price. And I've kind of alluded to this before, but I mean, it's 25 to 30 bucks a pop, and that's 5 to 8 hours of gameplay. I think even when you look at it as compared to like a Time Stories expansion or an Exit game, you're not getting the same value for your money out of this that you are out of those games. Now, you are getting a story, and it's a continuing story. So once you've completed this game, you're going to be able to continue that story eventually if you want to pay another $25 to $30. But that's kind of asking a lot. It's going to be $90 if you're buying this in all three pieces at full MSRP. And I would say that this probably represents the same amount of gameplay time as one of those chapters for a Telltale game. But those chapters from a Telltale game, you can get those for $5 or $10. This is costing you 30 bucks. That also means that those chapters in a Telltale game, there's usually 5 of those. So by the time you're done with that Telltale game, you're going to have, I don't know, 25 to 40 hours of gameplay, and it's going to cost you about $25 to $30. This is going to get you about 15 to 25 hours of gameplay in all 3 parts, and it's going to cost you $90. That's a problem. I don't know, expense is definitely an issue here as far as I'm concerned. Let's talk about the gameplay loop, which I like to talk about in any game. And the gameplay loop is essentially that thing that you are doing over and over and over. So if you like the gameplay loop in general, you're going to like the game. The gameplay loop in Cantaloop is looking at locations, reading the code, with the little red decoder, combining items, getting new items, and just figuring out puzzles. That is essentially the gameplay loop. If you like that, you'll like the game. The only problem there is the amount of game you're getting in time and the amount that you're spending. And replayability is basically none. I mean, once you finish this, you're done. I don't know if someone would want to keep the game until the next book. There's going to be a book 2 and a book 3. You don't really need to keep it. I mean, even if you only have a vague idea of what happened, I think that's enough to go into book 2. It's not, the narrative isn't super heavy or anything like that. So that means when you finish playing this game, what are you going to do with it? Give it away? Sell it? Donate it? I mean, they're all good things. So you'll make someone very happy, whether they get it at a affordable price or if some, kid maybe in a children's hospital or something gets to play it for free, that would be awesome. But for you, the buyer and the game player, your experience is pretty much limited to those 5 to 8 hours. So not a lot of replayability for you, I'm afraid. And then finally, comparisons. Well, I think the best games to compare this to are going to be other games where you're kind of solving a mystery, putting clues together, figuring out puzzles. And if we're not talking about the video games that kind of spawned this analog adaptation, then I think we're talking about games like Time Stories and Chronicles of Crime and Detective, a modern crime board game. And then to a lesser degree, but still fairly good comparison, are games like Exit the Game and the Unlock series. And like those games, there are a couple puzzles in this that are a little bit meta that you're going to need to think outside the box a little bit on. And as long as you do that, you're going to be okay. Now, whenever I do a flow review, I like to give someone some hot tips, some gaming tips. And I mean, there aren't a lot of tips for this because you're just solving puzzles. And like I said, there's only 5 to 8 hours of puzzles. And nevertheless, I think there will be some puzzles that you probably easily stumble into that you maybe didn't think you would get so quickly. And, kudos to you when you do that. And then there may be puzzles that for whatever reason, they just don't click with your brain, not right away. And as someone who sort of grew up with these video games and computer games back in the 80s and the 90s and things, my tip always with games like this is just put the game down. If you don't want to I really don't like to use hint systems in games like this, especially when the game is so short, because I don't want to ruin it for me. I find that if I go to the hint system, then, and have things answered for me, then when I finish the game, I kind of feel like I cheated or I just didn't get all of the gameplay that I could have. It's like I went to the back of the mystery novel and read the ending and kind of ruined it for myself. So I tend to not like to use clues. So if you are like me and you also like to not kind of spoil yourself and have something figured out for you, then my advice is to always, when you get stuck in a game like this, just put it away. Let your brain subconsciously work on it for a few days. You'll find weird things will happen. Either when you go to sleep, you might wake up the next day and you'll be like, aha, why don't I try this item with that item? Or, it may just kind of come to you. You could be out doing grocery shopping or working or driving to work or doing things, and something will just kind of suddenly occur to you. And then usually you come back to the game and you'll be able to solve that puzzle and you'll move forward. Another thing that I've found in games like this is a lot of times what'll happen is you'll kind of solve all the easy puzzles first, or the puzzles that you find easy, and you'll get to a point where it kind of funnels down in bottlenecks, and you'll get to a point where you have to solve some puzzle to get answers for other puzzles. You may not even know that at the time, but you'll just kind of be jammed up because you won't be able to make any forward progress. But a lot of times if you just solve one puzzle, then that may give you the answers you need to solve another puzzle, and things tend to, like dominoes, once you kind of crack that difficult puzzle you're having trouble with, a lot of times, you'll just solve a second, a third, a fourth thing right on top of it, and boom, you're good. And then you'll have a whole bunch of stuff to work on again. So again, in a situation like that, the thing I think you want to do is just step away, just walk away, let your subconscious work on it. Finally, let's talk about my likes and my dislikes for this game, because I do have some of both. Now, as I talked about earlier, I think that they've done a very solid analog adaptation of a point and click. They created solutions to make this work that I didn't necessarily think that they would be able to do, and they did it very well. And so I like that about it, and I like the artwork. I think the artwork works really well for the story and the style of game, and it's also very much in keeping with the games that inspired it. The inventory cards I mentioned, I really like that. I like how, if you've played these games before, you're always kind of picking up items, and you usually have like a list somewhere on your screen of all these items, and you can kind of scroll through it and examine them and combine them and stuff. I like the way that they imported that into these cards, and they kind of make it work with the cards. That's very clever and cool. And their hint system, I think, is good. I like how if you're having trouble in a certain puzzle, you can kind of figure out what that is and get a hint specifically for that. The hint system doesn't always work that well because their hints aren't always great. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. But the way the system itself is designed, I think, is very admirable. They did a good job with that. Now, what do I not like? Well, in spite of all the positive things I've said about it, I like the artwork, and it is clever to some degree, and it has some bad puns like some of its predecessors. The puns here are really bad, most of them, like just really bad. And I think the game is probably not as clever as it's a little clever, but it needs to be more clever. It's not as clever as I need it to be. So it's really not clever enough. It's not witty enough. And the most important thing, I think, there's really not enough material in this game, especially for the price point. I think it's too expensive for what it is. I think if this were to be selling for maybe $10, maybe even 15, let's say $10. I think at $10, that's probably about what that's worth. And then the other games, if they were to come out, they were $10 each, and you could get all three of them for $30. I feel like that would be a good price point. That means that this is a lot more expensive than those computer games. And that may be the packaging. Now, with computer games, of course, you've got staffing and development and all that stuff. You have to pay all of that. But with a game like this, you actually have to pay for the physical components. And you've got paper, you've got the binder, you've got, everything that's kind of involved with that, in addition to the artists and the designers and things like that. So I don't know if it's possible to make an analog adaptation at a price point that I think would be appropriate. But for this one, I think the price is too inflated. So from me to you, I would say if you see this, on a big sale, pick it up. I don't know how wide the printing is going to be. I know at a few stores like Miniature Market, Game Nerds, Card House, cool stuff. I think it's still at some of those, but some of those it's already gone. So if there wasn't a huge printing, you may not see this turn up cheaply anywhere. I just don't know. I think for me, for Cantaloop, I'm going to give it a 6.5 out of 10. And, if there had been a better ratio for money to time, I could have gone up higher. I could have gone up as high as an 8. So that 6.5 definitely reflects the value for your money I think you're getting, which I think is not that good. And also the fact that it's clever at times. There are parts of it that are kind of clever, and you do get that feeling sometimes when you finish a puzzle like, oh wow, like that was the solution. Aren't I clever? So it does a good job of making you feel clever at times, which is something I've always liked about that genre. But it's just not clever enough as so many of those games that are out there, those video games. And if you play those video games, you have more immersion. You're just looking at the screen, it's you at a controller. And I think that's something, I think this kind of throws a barrier in the way because it's an analog version. So, my advice to you would be, you're probably better off going and finding the remastered version of, some of the various Tales from Monkey Island games, or Day of the Tentacle, or Grim Fandango, or the Deponia games, or all that stuff. I know it's on PlayStation Network, some of those. Some of them have been harder to find since Telltale went out of business. Some of those games are on Steam. There's Edna and Harvey is another one. There are a lot of these games around. And I think you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck with some of the actual point and click video game adventures. Now, if you're like me and you grew up with these games and you love them and you really want to experience this, by all means, the nostalgia may carry you through a bit. Just know that it's going to be on the small end of content. It is going to be the equivalent of one of those, one of 5 pieces of a Telltale game, and you're going to be spending probably $25 to $30 for it, which I think is it more than it's worth. So that is my complete review. This has been Cantaloop Book 1, Breaking into Prison. If this is your first time at the channel, welcome. And if this video helped you at all, please consider subscribing. Also, please consider liking the video. And if you really like this video, you might want to consider hitting the alarm bell so that you can be notified whenever I publish videos in the future. Other than that, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to me, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.